Ezekiel 33:3.
Welcome to the Wednesday Bible Studies. My name is Jason, and today we're going to be covering Genesis chapters 24 to 29. So our agenda for today is we're going to review our study from last week. We'll do an overview of Genesis chapters 24 to 29. We'll see if there's any questions from the last study, and then we'll look at our reading for next week. Review from last week. We had Abraham. He encounters the Lord with two angels that look like men at Mamre, and Abraham serves them food. So this wasn't a vision. They were physically there. Sarah is told she will have a child in a year's time, and she laughs at the idea. The two men with the Lord leave to Sodom. The Lord tells Abraham of the coming judgment against Sodom and Gomorrah. The two angels arrive in Sodom and Gomorrah and go to Lot's house. Now you'll notice here the two men left from Sodom that were with the Lord, but once they enter into Sodom and Gomorrah, we can tell that they were two angels. So men look like angels, or at least angels look like men. The men of the city try to force themselves on the angels and are blinded. So the men in the city in Sodom gets its name from sodomy. They were trying to forcefully put themselves on the angels that arrived at Lot's house. The angels opened the door and then blinded the men. The angels take Lot and his family out of the city, but Lot's wife looks back and then turns to a pillar of salt. Lot's daughters get their father drunk, and then they father two children with him. Ben-Ami is the father of the Ammonites, and Moab is the father of the Moabites. It's kind of interesting to point out that these two children, Ben-Ami and Moab, they had a god show up that was called the Shamash. Shamash is the Shamash. It's a type of a solar deity. So we can see the sun god all the way back in the days of Moab and Ben-Ami. Then we see Abraham move from Mamre to Gerar in the Negev region. And then Abraham told King Abimelech his wife Sarah was his sister. King Abimelech has a vision from the Lord. Basically, at that point, the Lord threatens King Abimelech and tells him to release the wife of the prophet. King Abimelech provides Abraham with 1,000 shekels as well as cattle and slaves. This is making an atonement. Abraham prays for Abimelech and heals him. And Sarah gives birth to Isaac when Abraham was 100. Sarah was 90 and Ishmael 13. Abraham sends away Hagar and Ishmael with water, and they go to the desert of Beersheba. And then Hagar encounters an angel who says Ishmael will become a great nation. So both Isaac and Ishmael were promised to become a great nation. King Abimelech. Ishmael grew up to be an archer, and his mother found him a wife while in Egypt. Ishmael grew up to be an archer, and his mother found him a wife in Egypt while they were living in Paran. A peace treaty is made between Abraham, Abimelech, and Phicol, who's the military commander of King Abimelech. Abraham takes Isaac to be sacrificed within the Mount Moriah region. An angel has Abraham substitute Isaac for a ram caught in the thicket. So this is foreshadowing for the crucifixion, where the father sacrifices his son Christ. Abraham was blessed to be the father of many nations. This is what happens after he nearly sacrifices Isaac. And then Sarah dies in Hebron. Abraham buys land from a Hittite at Machpelah in Mamre. So basically, Abraham spoke to the people there. He needed an area of land to bury his loved ones. And so the Hittites had sold him this field. And now we're going to do our overview of Genesis chapter 24 to 29. And now we'll start our overview of Genesis chapter 24 to 29. Genesis chapter 24. So we followed Abraham, starting off in the land of Ur, and he made his way up to Haran, where he had a vision of from the Lord. Then he made his way down to Shechem, and then to Hebron and Ai, and then eventually made his way into the Negev, down to Egypt. And then he, Lot, and his wife came back from Egypt with more possessions, and then they split up. And when they split up, Lot went to go live in Sodom, and then Abraham, he stayed in Mamre. So we have Abraham in Mamre, in Hebron, and then Lot. Lot had just been returned back. He was taken captive, and then Abraham went up and chased and was able to return Lot and possessions. So we have Abraham in Mamre, in Hebron. In Genesis 24:9, we see something interesting. So the servant pulled his hand under the thigh of Abraham, and his master swore to him concerning this matter. This is something kind of foreign to Western culture. Basically, what would happen is when you were taking an important oath, especially when you're on your deathbed, you would call your son or your master or whatever the case would, your son or your servant, sorry, or whatever the case is, and they would take their hand and they would put it on the inner part of your thigh. I think today there might actually still be some cultures that grab their testes, the men, they grab their testicles and they take an oath while holding on to their genitals. So this is a type of Hebrew oath taking. So in the image here, what would happen is as the oath was being taken, the hand would be placed on the inside of the thigh. We see this actually in Genesis 47:29 as well. It says, "And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, 'If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt.'" So a little bit later, we'll be reading in Genesis 47. Now we can see in this situation, we have Jacob coming and then having his sons swear with their hand to his thigh. He did not want to be buried in Egypt. So here what we see is the servant is actually leaving from where Abraham is and going up to Haran. This is where Abraham met his wife Sarah. So the idea is to actually grab a wife for his son Isaac from within the family up in Haran. In Genesis 24:42, you read, "Then he prayed, 'Lord God of my master Abraham, make me successful today, and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I am standing beside the spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming to draw water. May it be that when I say to a young woman, 'Please let down your jar that I may have a drink,' and she says, 'Drink, and I'll water your camels too,' let her be the one that you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master." So here we can see the servant, he's saying a prayer, and he is hoping that the outcome will be that when he asks one of the ladies from the town for water, they'll respond in this way, and that will be his method of knowing that this was the woman that was chosen for Isaac by the Lord. So then he encounters Rebecca. Rebecca comes and not only gives him water, but also gives his camels water. In Genesis 24:42, we read, "Before I finished praying in my heart, Rebecca came out with her jar on her shoulder. She went down to the spring and drew water, and I said to her, 'Please give me a drink.' She quickly lowered her jar from her shoulder and said, 'Drink, I'll water your camels too.' So I drank, and she watered the camels also. I asked her, 'Whose daughter are you?' She said, 'The daughter of Bethuel, son of Nahor, whom Milcah bore to him.'" So if we take a look at the lineage, if we go through Adam and Eve and then Cain and Abel, Cain kills Abel, we'll now fall on the bloodline of Seth. From Seth, we'll go all the way down to Noah. The world was flooded. So Noah, his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives, they all come aboard this ark. And then they are the other ones that survive following the flood. After the flood, going down from Shem, if we go from Afrix, and then Selah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Sarug, Nahor. We can see this name Nahor. This was the name that just came up a couple seconds ago when we were looking at Rebecca. She says, "The daughter of Bethuel, son of Nahor, whom Milcah bore to him." So if we take a look here, we can see Nahor, we have Terah. So Terah was the father of Abraham. So if we break this down a little bit farther, we can see Terah fathered Nahor, and then Nahor fathered Bethuel. And so this is where we're seeing Rebecca is coming in. Rebecca is down here, and we can see her brother Laban. So Isaac marries Rebecca. In Genesis 23:66-67, this is after the servant brought Rebecca back from Haran. Then the servant told Isaac all he had done. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebecca. So she became his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So the Bible teaches actually that sex is marriage. A lot of people associate marriage today with a ceremony and the bride in white and the groom in black, and then all this ritual and custom associated to it. In the Bible, it was quite simple. Basically, in the Bible, what would happen is the two families would meet, and when the two families would meet, there'd be a big feast, there'd be a big party. And then halfway through the party, the bride and the groom would leave. The bride and the groom would go into their tent for their first time. That's where they would consummate the marriage. Once they would have sex, that was the marriage. The two flesh would become one. And then they would come out of the tent with a change of clothing, which is something that still happens today with the reception. The bride and groom have a change of clothing. They come back with their change of clothing. They would come back to the party, and they would actually give the priest the blanket in which they had laid upon. It's called the token of virginity. So in the Bible, sex is marriage, and we can actually see this with the situation involving Isaac and Rebekah, because as Isaac brought Rebekah into the tent of his mother Sarah, once they had consummated the marriage, that was the marriage. So Genesis 29:21-26. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife. My time is completed, and I want to make love to her." So Laban brought together all the people from the place and gave a feast. So here we can see the first part here, where everyone comes together for the feast. But when the evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. And Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one." So Jacob wanted the younger daughter, Rachel, but he received the older daughter, Leah. And so basically what happened was after the party, after the feast, Laban led the older sister Leah into Jacob's tent. Now keep in mind, this is a tent. It's not very well lit. In the morning, he realizes he has the wrong woman. In Genesis 24, the overview is Abraham has a servant swear an oath that he'll find Isaac a wife from amongst his relatives. The servant set out for Aram Naharaim and made his way to the town of Nahor. So Nahor is obviously named after the father of Terah. So this is Abraham's grandfather. The servant prayed to God, asking that the woman who offers water to both he and his camels would become the wife of Isaac. Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, she was the one who offered both water to the camels and to the servant. The servant gave a gold nose ring and 2 bracelets to Rebekah and asked if she had a place he could stay with his camels. Rebekah's brother Laban met the servant of Abraham, who told him the entire story and requested that Rebekah come back with him to marry Isaac. Isaac saw Rebekah approach on camels while sitting in the field, and then he took her into his tent, or into the tent of his mother Sarah, to marry her. Genesis 25. Abraham marries Keturah. So this is obviously after the death of his first wife. So Abraham marries Keturah. If we take a look here, you can see after Sarah died, Abraham remarried. There has been a rabbinical tradition, though, that has overlapped with Hagar being the same person as Keturah. The reason why was because Keturah was referred to as a concubine of Abraham in 1 Chronicles 132, and Hagar was also known as the concubine of Abraham, which is obviously how he had the son Ishmael. So there's been speculation in rabbinical tradition that Keturah and Hagar are the same person. However, it doesn't really fit. If you take a look, we'll take a look first at 1 Chronicles 32. And the sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine, she bore Zimran and Joksan and Midian and Midian and Ishbak and Sua, the sons of Jokshan, Sibah and Dedan. But if we take a look at the book of Jubilees, it's going to end this disagreement. So Jubilees is one of the deuterocanonical books. It's not part of the Old Testament. However, in Jubilees, it does actually talk about the situation. And it says in Jubilees 19:11, and Abraham took to himself a third wife, and her name was Keturah, from among the daughters of his household servants, for Hagar had died before Sarah. And she bare him 6 sons, Zimran and Jokshan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua in the 2 weeks of the year. So you can see exact same children that we saw listed in the Bible. And here we can see that Hagar died before Sarah, and this is in fact Abraham's third wife. So if we take a look at Abraham and his marriage to Keturah, a name that shows up here is Midian. It's one worth pointing out because Midian will show up later in the Torah in the book of Exodus. As a matter of fact, in Exodus 3:1, when we read about Moses, it says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian." So here we can see here the Midianites. The Midianites are coming through Abraham and Keturah. And here we can see the Midianites, they have a priesthood, and Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, he is a Midian priest. So this is where we'll see that name Midianites and Midian again. And he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire within the bush. So this conversation is actually happening just before God provides his name at that situation with the burning bush. So then we have Abraham. He dies at 175 years of age. In Genesis 23:19-20, what we're taking a look at here is actually the location of where they're being buried. So there was a field which was sold from the Hittite, which was bought from the Hittites, where the families were buried. As a matter of fact, you can still find this today. It is a tourist site. So in Genesis 23:19-20, you read, after Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. The burial site is supposed to reside right here today. Like I said, this is a tourist site. If you take a look inside, you will see there is a tomb of Sarah and a tomb of Abraham. You'll notice that the writing is in Arabic. You have to remember that Abraham was both the father of Islam as well as what went through the bloodline of Shem to eventually become King David, and then Solomon, all the way down to Joseph, Mary, and Christ. So we have a split from Abraham where we get Islam on one side and then Judaism and Christianity on the other. Isaac lives in Beer Lahai after the death of Abraham. So after Isaac's father dies, Isaac lives fairly close to where they were living originally in Mamre, but a little bit more to the southwest. Ishmael lives from Havilah to Shur. There are some discrepancies on the maps, but basically, if you take a look, you'll find that Ishmael resided all the way kind of going towards Egypt. That was his strip. So if you look at the map here, this area towards the west of Israel, basically in between Israel and Egypt, this is where Ishmael had resided. And then he went down a little bit farther, actually, towards the Sinai Peninsula, but not as far as where the Kaaba is today. There's some interesting discussion regarding how Islam received the Kaaba. The tradition is that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba, but we don't have any record, at least not biblical or Deuterocanonical books, that show Ishmael ever going that far. In Genesis 25, after the death of Sarah, Abraham marries Keturah. Abraham lived 175 years and gave everything he owned to Isaac. So he had other sons. Isaac and Ishmael buried Abraham in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, at Machpelah, where Sarah was buried. After the death of Abraham, Isaac resided near Beer Lahai, and Ishmael lived for 137 years, and his descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt as you go toward Ashur. Isaac was 40 when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean. And then Rebekah was barren, so Isaac prayed, and she became pregnant with twins. The twins wrestled in her room, and the Lord told Rebekah they would both be nations. One would be stronger, and the older would serve the younger. Esau, also known as Edom, was born first, described as red-skinned and hairy. This is really important because we never really had a description of a child in the Bible after they were born. It was just the child was born, but no physical description. So there was something very different about the birth of Esau and the way that Esau looked compared to other children that had been born prior. The skin coloration, as well as he was quite hairy. Jacob was born second, holding the heel of Esau when he was born. Esau grew to be a hunter, and Jacob preferred to stay near the tents at home. And Esau sold his birthright to Jacob after coming home from the field starving. Genesis 26. The Lord appears to Isaac and tells him to stay in the land of Gerar. So if we take a look here, the land of Gerar, if we can actually see the Negev, this land of Gerar area is close to where the Oaks of Mamre were, and it went all the way down to Beer Lahai, where Isaac was residing just before Egypt. Isaac deceives King Abimelech. So the same way that his father in the past had deceived the king by saying that his wife was his sister, Isaac follows in the footsteps of his father and does the exact same thing. When the king finds out he was deceived, he was obviously not impressed and gave Isaac his wife back. And Isaac explains how his wife is actually his sister, technically speaking, obviously because he had received her from Haran. We learn about Isaac's increase in prosperity. We learn about 3 wells, Esek, Sitnah, and Rehoboth. So basically, while Isaac was living in the land, there was argument over these wells. The first two wells, there was contention. And then the last well, Rehoboth, that was the well that the Lord had provided. So basically, the Lord had made room for them to live in that land. Isaac actually increases so much in prosperity that this eventually leads to Phicol and Abimelech. So Phicol is the commander. He comes up with the king, and then they come up with a treaty because they were fearful that Isaac would eventually increase in such power that they would become a threat to the people living in the land. So Isaac accepts their treaty and prepares a meal for them, and then they feast, and then in the morning they fulfill this treaty. What's interesting is this treaty is fulfilled at an area called Beersheba, which comes up quite a bit. It came up actually when we heard about Ishmael and Hagar being sent away into the desert of Beersheba. And then here we can see their oath is being taken at the well of Beersheba. Beersheba means the well of seven. It's a place in the Negev. And the reason why it's called the well of seven, actually earlier what you had seen was the sacrifice had been done at this well earlier, prior to Isaac, and the sacrifice was done with 7 lambs. So the 7 is coming from the sacrifice of the 7 lambs that were sacrificed earlier in the book of Genesis at Beersheba. Here, if we take a look, we can see the 12 tribes of Israel. Israel is Jacob. We'll find a little bit later that Jacob is renamed as Israel. So Israel is not a place, it's a person. The land was divided amongst his 12 sons. You could call them the 12 sons of Jacob, 12 sons of Israel, makes no difference, but the land was divided amongst them today, which we call the state of Israel. We have the Edomites, which were the brothers of Jacob. Edomites came from the child Esau, so Esau and Edom is the same thing. Edom actually has an association to the color red, and you'll find that when Esau was born, he was red and hairy. Isaac had a brother called Ishmael, and this is where the Arabs comes from, but we're going to focus today, right now at least, on Esau and the Edomites and Jacob. When we take a look at where the Edomites resided south of the kingdom of Judah. So the kingdom of Edom, you can see it on the map there with Petra and Bozrah on the other side. Edom today would be Jordan, or at least parts of Jordan. We have this infamous scene where basically Jacob and Esau, so basically Jacob is at home, Esau comes in from the field after hunting, he's absolutely famished, and then what happens is that Esau gives up his birthright. So Esau gives up his birthright, he gives it to his brother Jacob, and he gives it to him over a bowl of soup. The soup is called Edom soup, which means red soup. Some traditions outside of the Bible hold that the soup itself, it wasn't fully cooked and that there was blood in the soup, and that's where the red came from. And so the soup wasn't fully prepared. Esau, being famished, didn't care and wanted to eat it anyway, and so he would have broken one of the seven Noahide laws, which had to do with not eating blood. But again, this is tradition. This is not something written in the Bible. Basically, what you get in the Bible is that Jacob receives the birthright of Esau because Esau sells it to him for the bowl of soup when he comes in famished. In Genesis 25:25, again, we saw that when Esau was born, he came out all red and hairy like a garment. This is why they called him Esau, because he was red and hairy. So there's an association to his name and the color red. So Esau and Edom and red. So part of the reason for this could be, quite possibly, is that you had a child that was born with less melanin. This happens today. It's possible to have 2 twins where one child could be dark and one child would be light. And of course, the redness coming out all red, that could be describing a child that has their blood showing through their skin, which is something that would be very different because, of course, dark-skinned people, when they get a sunburn or just in general, you're not seeing the blood through the skin.
These pretty teens are best friends, and they're also something else. Something that may surprise you.
We're twins.
Believe it or not, they're twins.
Yep, we're twins. We're same
twin
mum,
sisters.
same dad.
You heard right. They have the same mom and dad. What are the odds that one would be black and one white?
A lot of people are just in shock.
Lucy and Maria Aylmer live in Gloucester, England. Maria has a caramel complexion, brown eyes, and thick curly black hair. Lucy has pale white skin, ginger red hair, blue eyes, and freckles. Most people have the same reaction when they hear they are twins.
They say, how did it happen? We don't believe you.
So, how did it happen? Their mom, Donna, is half black and half white. The twins' dad, Vince, is white. The couple was thrilled when a sonogram revealed they were expecting twins.
I just cried. It was shock.
Mom did a double take when she delivered one black and one white baby.
I'm so glad Mum dressed us in such cute little outfits.
Mom dressed her adorable twin daughters in matching outfits, just like twins everywhere. But by age 10, Lucy says she didn't feel like a twin, so why dress like one?
We don't look alike, so why should we have to wear the exact same thing?
Maria says she once wished for Lucy's straight hair.
I used to cry about it. I hate my curly hair.
And Lucy says she was sometimes taunted at school.
They thought I was adopted and calling me a ghost.
Now 18, the twins not only look different, they have very different personalities.
We're completely different.
Maria loves getting dressed up in chic clothing. She is very outgoing.
I love meeting people. Like, I'm not scared to approach people or anything, so.
Whereas I'm terrified of going up to random strangers.
Lucy prefers casual clothes, but they've come to embrace their uniqueness as black and white twins.
If I have kids one day, they might come out looking like Lucy.
So this could be something having to do with recessive genes, or in this case with Jacob and Esau, this could have to do with a lack of melanin. Melanin is what produces pigment, so it's quite possible that there was some kind of melanin deficiency, and this is why you would have one child that would be dark and one child that would be light, coming from a mother and father that would likely be darker. So if we take a look here, this is actually in Jordan. These are the rock hotels in Jordan. It's quite interesting because in the Bible, you find out that when Esau lost his birthright and his blessing, he ended up actually living in the mountains. So he had no blessing of land, so he went and lived in the hills of Seir with the Horites, and he basically made his dwelling within the clefts of the mountains. It's quite interesting to see that these lines in the Bible that speak about where Esau had lived, we can see that they're actually validated by the sense that here we have these amazing structures where they're literally like buildings built into a mountain. When we take a look at the architecture, though, it looks very, very similar to what we saw later in the Roman Empire, almost identical. What's interesting is there have been people that have written about the idea that the Edomites had eventually migrated into Rome. I've heard the rumor with the idea of a group called the Issachar Kings, but basically there have been several books written on the idea of Esau eventually moving into Rome and living in Rome as one part in time. As a matter of fact, if you take a look in the Jewish encyclopedias, the Jewish encyclopedias do associate Rome with Edom. Edom, you'll see the definition, it says the name of a condiment. The reason why is because it had to do with ketchup, and ketchup is red. If you take a look here, it says the same as Edom. Edom means to be red. So Esau, Edom is associated to red. And if you take a look actually on the far right-hand side where it says Exodus 25:5, you'll notice that when it's talking about ram skins being dyed red, the word is Edom, which is where Edom came from. So this is Edom soup. It was like a lentil soup. And again, the tradition was that the lentil soup had raw meat in it that wasn't cooked yet, which is why it was red. But again, that's tradition. That's not biblical. So again, this was about Esau selling his birthright. We read about this in verse 29, where it says, one day while Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the field and was famished. He said to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stew, for I am famished. That's also why he is called Edom. First, sell me your birthright, Jacob replied. Look, said Esau, I'm about to die, so what good is my birthright to me? Swear it to me first, Jacob said. So Esau swore to Jacob and sold him the birthright. Then Jacob gave him some bread and lentil stew to Esau. He ate and drank, and he got up and went away. Thus Esau despised his birthright. If we take a look in the book of Jasher, we'll actually get some more details on this. Book of Jasher is a deuterocanonical book. This will just give you some more details, take it or leave it, but it does kind of explain why Esau was so famished that he would sell his birthright. And Esau said at that time, after the death of Abraham, frequently went to the field to hunt. And Nimrod, the king of Babel, the same was Amraphel, had also frequently went with his mighty men to hunt in the field, and to walk about with his men in the cool of the day. And Nimrod was observing Esau all the days, for a jealousy was formed in the heart of Nimrod against Esau all the days. And on a certain day, Esau went in the field to hunt, and he found Nimrod walking in the wilderness with his 2 men. And all his mighty men and his people were with him in the wilderness, but they removed at a distance from him. And they went from him in different directions to hunt. And Esau concealed himself for Nimrod, and he lurked for him in the wilderness. And Nimrod and his men that were with him did not know him. And Nimrod and his men frequently walked about in the field at the cool of the day, and to know where his men were hunting in the field. And Nimrod and 2 of his men that were with him came to the place where they were, when Esau started suddenly from his lurking place, and drew his sword, and hastened and ran to Nimrod, and cut off his head. And Esau fought a desperate fight with the 2 men that were with Nimrod. And when they called out to him, Esau turned to him and smote them to death with his sword. And all the mighty men of Nimrod, who had left him to go into the wilderness, heard a cry at the distance, and they knew the voices of those 2 men, and they ran to know the cause of it. And when they found their king and the 2 men that were with him lying dead in the wilderness. And when Esau saw the mighty men of Nimrod coming at a distance, he fled, and thereby escaped. And Esau took the valuable garments of Nimrod, which Nimrod's father had bequeathed to Nimrod, and with which Nimrod prevailed over the whole land, and he ran and concealed them in his house. And Esau took those garments and ran into the city on account of Nimrod's men. And he came unto his father's house wearied and exhausted from fight, and he was ready to die through grief when he approached his brother Jacob and sat before him. So here we get a little more context here. It wasn't just a matter of Esau being hungry one day. If we take what was said in Jasher and the accounts of what Esau was doing when he was hunting, apparently when Esau was hunting, he ended up hunting near King Nimrod and then slaying King Nimrod and his men. So Esau was running home for his life, and chances are he probably ran or at least traveled for days just to try to separate himself from King Nimrod's men. So he came back to his home almost half alive, with obviously hadn't eaten nothing, which is why he was ready to die when he approached Jacob. And he said to his brother Jacob, "Behold, I shall die this day, and wherefore should I do with my birth? And wherefore then do I want with my birthright?" And Jacob acted wisely with Esau in this matter. And Esau sold his birthright to Jacob, for it was so brought about by the Lord. And Esau's portion in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which Abraham had brought the children of Heth for the possession of a burial ground, Esau also sold to Jacob. And Jacob bought all of this from his brother for the value given. So here we can see that with this birthright that Esau lost, the birthright that he lost was access to land. And so we can see here that this field at Machpelah, he lost his portion of it. So this was the burial place for, at this point, Abraham and his wife, Sarah. And Jacob wrote the whole of this in a book, and he testified the same with witnesses, and he sealed it. And the book remained in the hands of Jacob. And when Nimrod, the son of Cush, died, he lifted him up and brought him into consternation, and buried him in the city. And all the days that Nimrod lived were 215 years, and he died. And the days that Nimrod reigned upon the people of the land were 185 years. And Nimrod died by the sword of Esau in shame and contempt. And the seed of Abraham caused his death, and he had seen in his dream. And at the death of Nimrod, his kingdom became divided into many nations. And all those parts that Nimrod reigned over were restored to the respective kings of the land, who recovered them after the death of Nimrod. And all the people of the house of Nimrod were for a long time enslaved to all the other kings of the land. So in Genesis 26, we saw the Lord appeared to Isaac and told him there was a famine and not to go into Egypt, but to stay in Gerar. Isaac states that his wife Rebekah is his sister, so he falls in the same steps as his father Abraham. King Abimelech discovers that she is his wife and commands that no one touch his wife. Isaac increased greatly in wealth and cattle, stirring the jealousy of the Philistines. The Philistines filled the wells Abraham had dug, and King Abimelech asked Isaac to leave as he had become too powerful. So this is where they were fighting over these 3 wells. The 2 wells, there was contention, and the last well, Rehoboth, was the well that Isaac had taken. Isaac moved into the valley of Gerar and unearthed the well previously used by his father Abraham. Isaac found another 3 wells, Esek, Sitnah, and Rehoboth, 2 of which he had quarreled over with the people of Gerar, and Rehoboth he kept. Rehoboth means, and the Lord made space. Isaac moved to Beersheba, had a vision from the Lord, then built an altar and another well. Abimelech came to visit Isaac with his advisor and military commander requesting a peace treaty. Isaac prepares a feast for the king, and in the morning swears an oath to keep peace amongst them. The servants dug another well called Shibah, which is where the town of Beersheba receives its name. When Esau was 40, he married 2 Hittite women, Judith and Bosmat, which grieved his parents. So the whole reason that Esau married the Genesis 27. Isaac calls on Esau to go hunt, bring some of his favorite game, then Isaac would eat it and bless Esau. Rebekah tells Jacob and convinces him to impersonate his brother using Esau's clothing, goatskins, and Rebekah provided the meal. Jacob was blessed with heaven's dew, fatness of the land, nations would serve him, and he would be lord over his brothers. Esau learned that his brother stole his blessing and that would serve his brother until he removed his yoke. So this is interesting. First, Esau loses his birthright because he sells it to his brother. And now we're seeing that Esau is being tricked out of his blessing by his brother Jacob. So Jacob's walking away with two things here. He's taking the birthright, and then in Genesis 27, we see he's also taking the blessing from his dying father. Esau planned to kill his brother Jacob after he finished mourning their father. Rebekah tells Jacob to leave to Haran, where her brother Laban lives, hoping to protect him from Esau and marrying a Hittite woman like his brother. So Esau had grieved the family by marrying a Hittite because the Hittite were Canaanites and they weren't supposed to do that. And so Rebekah was trying to protect her son Jacob, who Esau was obviously very wrath at, and also at the same time stop him from marrying a Hittite like his brother did by sending him up to her brother Haran. Genesis 28. So we see Jacob leaves for Haran. In Genesis 28, 6-9, it says, Now Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Paddan Aram to take a wife there, as it had been blessed and directed him. You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women. And that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and gone to Paddan Aram. So when Esau saw that the Canaanite woman did not please Isaac his father, Esau went to Ishmael, took as his wife. Esau went to Ishmael and took as his wife, besides the wives he had, Mahalath and the daughters of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth. So here we can see in this situation here, Esau tries to basically make an amends with his parents because he feels, well, if they're not happy about the Canaanite women, maybe they will be less offended if I marry an Ishmaelite. Because, of course, Abraham had married Hagar, had a child with Hagar. Hagar is where we receive Ishmael, and then Ishmael is where we have the Ishmaelites. So Esau was thinking, well, since Abraham married Keturah and Abraham had a child, Ishmael, with Hagar, it should be better to marry an Ishmaelite than it would be to marry a Canaanite. Later, we see that Jacob, on his way to Paddan Aram, he has this vision. This you could call Jacob's ladder or a stairway to heaven. Basically, what Jacob sees is a stairway and a vision where he sees angels ascending and descending with the Lord sitting at the top of this ladder. Jacob decides if God keeps him safe, clothed, and returned him home, that he would be his God. So when Jacob awakens from this dream of seeing these angels, he decides that if he makes a safe passage, basically to Haran and then back, and then he is kept fed and clothed, that the God of Abraham would be his God. In Genesis 28, Isaac calls for Jacob, blessed him, and commanded him to go to Paddan Aram in Haran to live with Laban and marry one of his daughters. Esau heard of his parents' displeasure with his marriage of the Hittite woman, so Esau then married Mahalath, who was the daughter of Ishmael. Jacob left from Beersheba for Haran and stopped along the way where he had a vision of angels ascending and descending a ladder. In the vision, the Lord told Jacob he would be blessed with many descendants who would live on that land he was residing on. Jacob made a vow that if God would protect him on his journey, clothe him, feed him, and safely return him home, that the Lord would be his God. Genesis 29. Jacob arrives in Paddan Aram. When Jacob arrives in Paddan Aram, he sees Rachel for the first time, and he immediately falls in love with her. Jacob works for Laban for 7 years. So he wants to marry Rachel, and so he makes a deal with Laban where he says, I will work for 7 years in return for the hand of Rachel. So Jacob then works for Laban for 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, they throw a feast, and there's a party, and at the end of the party, Laban leads Leah, the older sister, into the tent of Jacob, and Jacob ends up sleeping with the older sister instead of Rachel, the younger sister. Jacob then works for another 7 years for Laban because he still wants Rachel. And so now Jacob has two wives. Leah, the first wife, is the older sister, and then Rachel, the younger sister, which is who he was desiring. When we take a look at the name Jacob, though, it's kind of interesting because it seems like he basically got a taste of his own medicine because he had just tricked his brother Esau and stole his blessing. If we take a look here at the name Jacob, Jacob has a word origin. It's Akub. And if we take a look at the word origin, it says a heel, footprint, or hind part. So we're talking obviously the back of the foot. This is talking about Genesis 25:26. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. So right here, we can see Jacob's name is associated to holding the heel of his brother Esau. In other words, when we say pulling your leg, it means you're telling someone a joke. You can see here the leg puller or a joker is coming right from the word Jack or Jacob. And then it finishes with Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So Jacob actually has the name leg puller, and a leg puller is like a joker. So first we see Jacob basically pretending to be his brother, taking the blessing of his brother, and then as he goes up to find himself a wife, he finds that he's tricked by Laban, and then he has to work another 7 years from Laban because of this situation that happened where Laban tricked him. So first, from Leah, the older sister, we see the birth of Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. So at this point, we find that Rachel, the younger, she's barren, and Leah is able to produce four male children. And she thought by producing these four sons that Jacob would love her because Leah obviously knew that Jacob loved Rachel more. And she thought, obviously, by bringing him this many sons, that she would be the favored. In Genesis 29, it's first we see Jacob arrive in Paddan Aram to find shepherds tending their flocks near a well. Jacob asks them of Laban and meets Rachel, who is a shepherd, and then he tells her that he and they are relatives. Rachel tells Laban the news, and he rushes out to meet Jacob. Jacob offers to work for Laban for 7 years to marry his younger daughter Rachel. After 7 years, Jacob requests his wife, and Laban throws a feast, but brings out the daughter Leah to Jacob's tent. So as soon as the two slept together, now Jacob was married to Leah. So that's officially his wife. Jacob was tricked by Laban and worked for another 7 years for Rachel. The Lord saw Laban was not loved and enabled her to conceive, but not Rachel. Leah gave birth to her first child, Reuben, followed by Simeon. Leah gave birth to her third son, Levi, then to Judah. And Judah, we find Judah is where we have Christ come through. So Judah is the line where Christ comes through. And Levi is the line we'll find later that Moses and Aaron come through. Some bonus content. Who made the Kaaba? So who built the Kaaba? If we take a look, the Kaaba is located in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca. This is obviously a very important religious site to Islam. The story behind the Kaaba, though, is, at least from the Quran, that Abraham and Ishmael had built the Quran. So if you actually take a look, it says here in Genesis 25:17 to 18, these were the years of life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he breathed his last breath and died, and was gathered to his people. They dwelt from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt as you go towards Assyria. He died in the presence of all of his brethren. So here in Genesis 25, you get a pretty good idea in regards to the area in which Ishmael was dwelling. Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt, isn't coming anywhere near where Mecca is today. So at least coming from a biblical standpoint, even looking at the Deuterocanonical books, there is nothing biblically that we can use to explain how the Kaaba was built, as there is no record of Abraham or Ishmael being anywhere near close enough to Mecca to have built the Kaaba. However, if you take a look in the Quran, in Surah 22:26, it says, "And mention, O Muhammad, when we designated for Abraham the site of the house, do not associate anything with me and purify my house for those who perform tawaf and those who stand in prayer and those who bow and prostrate." So here where it says, we designated for Abraham the site of the house here they're referring to is the Kaaba. And if you take a look a little bit farther, it says, "Purify my house for those who perform tawaf." This we know for sure is referring to the Kaaba because, of course, tawaf is what you would see when the pilgrimage called the Hajj is performed, where Muslims would go once in their life to Mecca and they would go 7 times counterclockwise around the Kaaba. That's known as Tawaf. So here we can tell in Surah 22:26, it seems as if the Quran is pointing out the idea that Abraham had something to do with the building of the Kaaba. Two reasons why that's a problem. One, historically, we have no other place to confirm this aside from the Quran. And the second reason is because the Tawaf action itself would be a form of idol worship. It seems like the practice of the Hajj and the pilgrimage to Mecca is something that would seem like it's the veneration of idols. And I don't think Abraham would be have anything to do with that. Of course, you'll see when the Tawaf is performed, men will go around the Kaaba, but not only that, they will kiss the Kaaba stone. In Genesis 21:14-15, it says, "So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and put it on her shoulder. He gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba." So in Genesis 21, we can see this is where Hagar and Ishmael had wandered, Beersheba. So we're not anywhere close to the Kaaba here. And then if we take a look at Genesis 25:17-18, we already read this, but it says, "They dwelt from Havilah as far as Shur to the east of Egypt when you go to Assyria." So if you take a look up here, this is where Shur is. And obviously we have Egypt over here. So this area was the area typically where you had the Ishmaelites dwelling. Down here near Saudi Arabia, not even close. So this idea of Ishmael going all the way down to the Kaaba, we just don't have the history to prove that. So our reading for next week we're going to read Genesis chapters 30 all the way to 35. So you'll be reading to the end of 35. And if you have any questions about the reading we did today or about the reading for next week, send your questions to questions@ezekiel333.com. Try to get them in by Monday so I can make a couple slides, and I will see you next week at 6.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. If you hear the watchman's call, please repent and seek out Jesus Christ. There is still time. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.